March 14th, 1867, the Carpathian foothills just beyond the mist-choked village of Valkia, in the shadow of the Transylvanian Alps. The moon hung low that night, swollen and pale as a corpse's eye, watching as the iron door to the eastern cellar of Csejte Manor groaned shut. Inside, a girl of 16 winters, barefoot, dressed in rags that had once been white, was thrown into darkness so complete it swallowed her breath. But she was not alone. 8 hounds, ribs pressing against matted fur like prison bars, circled her with eyes that glowed feral and hungry. The Baroness Erzsébet Corvinus stood above, her silhouette framed by torchlight, her smile sharp as a blade. She had given the order herself. Let the dogs decide her worth. This was no ordinary punishment. This was theater. Erzsébet Corvinus, widow of a disgraced nobleman and inheritor of a crumbling estate, ruled her lands with the cruelty of someone who had lost everything but power. Her servants whispered that she had gone mad after her husband's death. Mad with grief, mad with rage, mad with the need to prove that she still held dominion over life and death. The girl, known only as Ilona, had been taken from a nearby village as payment for her father's debts. She had served in silence for 2 years, enduring beatings, starvation, and humiliations that would have broken most. But when Ilona dared to meet the Baroness's eyes during a dinner with visiting nobility, dared to stand upright when told to kneel, Erzsébet saw defiance. And defiance in the Baroness's world was a sin punishable only by annihilation. The 8 dogs had not been fed in 4 days. The cellar had no windows. No one expected Ilona to survive the night. What happened in that cellar over the next 72 hours would become legend. A story told in taverns and churchyards, whispered by grandmothers to warn children of the darkness that lives in the hearts of the powerful and the light that can emerge from the powerless. But before we walk into that darkness with Ilona, before we witness the impossible, I need you to do something. This is not just a story. This is a reckoning with history, with cruelty, with the human spirit's refusal to be devoured. If you believe that some stories must be told, no matter how brutal, subscribe. If you believe that the forgotten deserve to be remembered, leave a comment with the name of someone history tried to erase, because what you're about to hear is not fiction. It's the echo of a girl who walked into hell and came out leading her demons. Now let us descend. The cellar beneath Csejte Manor was older than the house itself, a remnant of some forgotten fortress, built when these lands belonged to warlords who measured their power in blood and bone. The walls were carved from limestone that wept with moisture, slick and cold as a tomb. No torches, no candles, only the absolute black that exists beneath the earth, where even shadows cannot live. When the iron door slammed shut behind Ilona, the sound echoed like a death knell, and then there was silence, the kind of silence that presses against your ears until you hear your own heartbeat like war drums. She stood perfectly still, her bare feet on stone so cold it burned. Her breath came in shallow gasps, visible in the frigid air even though she could not see it, and then she heard them. The dogs. Not barking. No, they were too weak for that, too consumed by hunger to waste energy on noise. Instead, she heard the scrape of claws on stone, the wet sound of panting, the low guttural growl that vibrated in the chest before it reaches the throat. 8 pairs of eyes ignited in the darkness like coals stirred to life. Ilona had grown up around dogs. Her father had kept 3 hunting hounds before the debt collectors came. She knew their language, the difference between a growl of warning and a growl of intention. These dogs were not warning her. They were deciding. The Baroness had chosen her weapons well. These were not pampered estate dogs. They were Kangals, Turkish shepherd beasts, bred for centuries to kill wolves and protect livestock from bears. Each one weighed more than Ilona. Each one had jaws strong enough to crush bone. And each one had been starved deliberately, methodically, until their ribs stood out like the bars of cages and their eyes held nothing but the void of hunger. The largest, a male with a torn ear and a scar across his muzzle, stepped forward first. His head was low, his lips pulled back to reveal teeth like yellow daggers. Ilona did not run. She could not run. There was nowhere to go. The cellar was 15 feet square. The door was iron and bolted from the outside, so instead she did the only thing left to her. She knelt, and she began to sing. The song that rose from Ilona's throat was not one taught in churches or sung at noble banquets. It was older than that, older than Christianity, older than the manor above, older perhaps than the stones themselves. It was a collada, a winter hymn her grandmother had taught her when she was small enough to fit in the crook of an arm, a song the village women sang when the snow fell too deep and the wolves came too close. The melody was haunting, circular, repetitive, the kind of sound that wraps around the mind and refuses to let go. It spoke of hunger, of cold, of survival, of creatures who knew the forest better than men, who understood that life and death were not opposites but partners in an eternal dance. Her voice cracked at first, thin and fragile in the suffocating dark. But she pushed through, forcing air through her fear, through the tightness in her chest, through the certainty that she was about to die. The lead dog stopped. His growl faltered, his head tilted just slightly, as if listening to something he had not heard in a very long time. Behind him, the others shifted. One whined, a high-pitched sound of confusion. Another sat, haunches trembling with exhaustion and indecision. Ilona kept singing. She sang through the tears that streamed down her face. She sang through the cold that turned her lips numb. She sang because it was the only weapon she had, the only thing the Baroness could not take from her. And slowly, so slowly it seemed like a dream, the lead dog lowered himself to the ground, not in submission, not in surrender, but in something else. Recognition, perhaps, or exhaustion so complete that even hunger became secondary to it. Ilona's voice softened. She shifted from the collada to a lullaby, one her mother had sung when the fevers came, when death sat at the edge of the bed and waited. It was a song about rest, about peace, about the mercy of sleep. One by one, the other dogs lay down. Their eyes remained open, fixed on her, glowing in the darkness like 8 small moons, but they did not attack, not yet. The night was long, and hunger, Ilona knew, always returned. Hours passed, or perhaps only minutes. In absolute darkness, time loses its shape, becomes liquid, becomes irrelevant. Ilona's voice had worn to a whisper, her throat raw as if she had swallowed glass. The cold had seeped so deep into her bones that she no longer shivered. Her body had surrendered that small rebellion, conserving what little warmth remained in her core. The dogs had not moved. They lay in a rough circle around her, their breathing synchronized into a collective rhythm that sounded almost like the ocean. If the ocean could starve, if the ocean could die. She knew this peace was temporary. She knew that when morning came, if morning ever came to this lightless tomb, the hunger would override whatever fragile truce her song had created. So Ilona made a decision. She would not wait for them to tear her apart. She would meet them as equals. Slowly, with movements so deliberate they seemed carved from stone, she extended her hand. Not toward the lead dog. That would be a challenge, an insult to his authority. Instead, she reached toward the smallest, a female whose ribs were so pronounced they cast shadows even in shadows. The dog's eyes tracked the movement. A growl rippled through the pack, low and warning. But Ilona did not pull back. Her fingers, pale and trembling, hovered in the frozen air between them. "I have nothing," she whispered in Romanian, her native tongue, though she knew the dogs could not understand the words. "No food, no warmth, no salvation. I am as forsaken as you." Her voice broke on the last word, and something in that breaking, some raw, honest acknowledgement of shared damnation, made the small female shift. The dog's nose, dry and cracked from dehydration, touched Ilona's fingertips. The contact lasted only a heartbeat, but it was enough. Ilona moved closer, inch by excruciating inch, until she could press her palm flat against the dog's skull. The fur was matted, filthy, alive with parasites. Beneath it, she could feel the fever heat of starvation, the body consuming itself to stay alive. "We are the same," Ilona whispered. "Both of us locked here to die for someone else's pleasure." The dog closed her eyes and leaned into the touch. By the time the first gray light of dawn leaked through the hairline cracks in the cellar door, thin as spider silk, pale as ghost breath, Ilona had touched each dog, not petted, not comforted, touched, acknowledged. She had crawled on hands and knees across the freezing stone, moving from one dying beast to the next, whispering words that meant nothing and everything. She told them about her village, about the river that ran silver in summer and froze black in winter, about her father who had sold her to pay a debt he did not owe to a lord who did not care, about her mother dead from childbed fever when Ilona was 7, about the younger brother she would never see again. The dogs listened. Or perhaps they simply lacked the strength to do anything else. But their eyes followed her, their breathing steadied in her presence, and when she finally collapsed against the far wall, her body shutting down from cold and exhaustion, they did something extraordinary. They moved closer. The led dog, the scarred male with the torn ear, rose first, his legs trembling beneath him like a newborn colt. He crossed the space between them and lowered himself beside her, his massive body forming a wall against the draft that bled through the stone, then the small female, then another, until all 8 dogs had arranged themselves around Ilona in a living barrier, their combined body heat creating a pocket of warmth in the frozen dark. It was not kindness. Dogs do not operate on kindness. It was pack logic, the ancient arithmetic of survival. Warmth shared is warmth multiplied. A lone creature freezes, a pack endures. Ilona, half-conscious, felt their weight against her, the rise and fall of rib cages, the thunder of 8 hearts beating in different rhythms that somehow harmonized into one. She understood, in that liminal space between waking and dying, that the Baroness had made a miscalculation. She had thrown Ilona to the beasts expecting slaughter, but she had forgotten that beasts understand suffering better than humans ever could. And suffering, when recognized, when shared, becomes something else entirely. It becomes alliance. The second day was worse. Hunger is patient, but it is not kind. It whispers at first, a gentle reminder of need. Then it speaks louder, cramping the stomach, turning the mouth bitter with bile. By the second day, it screams, it howls, it becomes the only truth that exists. Ilona woke, if waking is the right word for clawing back to consciousness in absolute darkness, to the sound of one dog whimpering. Not the aggressive whine of a predator, but the broken cry of a creature in pain. She recognized it immediately, the young male barely past adolescence, his body not yet hardened to deprivation. He was dying faster than the others. She could hear it in his breathing, shallow and rapid, the desperate panting of a system beginning to fail. The other dogs had moved away from him, creating distance. Pack animals are pragmatic. They recognize death and withdraw from it, preserving resources for those who might survive. But Ilona did not withdraw. She crawled toward the sound, her own body screaming with every movement. Her lips were cracked and bleeding. Her tongue felt swollen, foreign in her mouth. She had not eaten in 3 days, had not drunk water in 2. The Baroness had ensured that not even mercy could reach this place. When Ilona's hands found the young dog, his body was convulsing. Seizures brought on by starvation, the brain consuming itself, firing random electrical storms as it died. She pulled him close, cradling his massive head in her lap, and began to hum. Not a song this time, just sound, just the vibration of one living thing acknowledging another. The dog's seizures slowed, his breathing evened. And then, with a final exhale that sounded almost like relief, he stopped. The cellar filled with a different kind of silence, heavy, final. Ilona held the dead dog for hours, unable to let go, her tears falling onto his matted fur and freezing there like small diamonds. The remaining 7 dogs watched from the darkness, and something shifted. The pack had lost one of its own, and somehow, impossibly, Ilona had become the one who mourned him. The third day brought a sound that did not belong to the cellar, footsteps, heavy, deliberate, descending the stone stairs beyond the iron door. Then voices, muffled, cautious, speaking in Hungarian, the language of the estate's servants. Ilona's heart, sluggish from dehydration and hypothermia, suddenly lurched into a panicked rhythm. The dogs heard it too. 7 heads lifted as one, ears pricked forward, bodies tensing with the last reserves of predatory instinct. The bolt scraped, metal shrieked against metal, and then light, sudden, violent, blinding, flooded the cellar as the door swung open. Ilona could not see. Her eyes, adjusted to 3 days of absolute darkness, revolted against the torchlight. She raised an arm to shield her face, squinting through tears and pain. 2 figures stood silhouetted in the doorway. Theodore, the groundskeeper, a man of 60 with hands like tree roots and a face carved by decades of winter wind. And beside him, Magda, the cook, white as a barrel and just as sturdy, her expression unreadable beneath her headscarf. They had come, Ilona understood with sickening clarity, to retrieve her body. The Baroness had sent them to clean up the aftermath of her entertainment, to drag out whatever remained and bury it quietly before questions could be asked. But they stopped, frozen at the threshold, because Ilona was not dead, and neither were the dogs. Theodore's mouth fell open. Magda crossed herself, lips moving in silent prayer. Sfanta Fecioara Maria, Magda whispered. Holy Virgin Mary. The 7 dogs had formed a wall in front of Ilona, their bodies low, their eyes reflecting the torchlight like molten copper. The dead dog lay behind her, still cradled in her arms. She looked, Theodore would later tell others in the village tavern, like a saint in a painting or a demon summoned from hell. Pale as alabaster, hollow-eyed, skeletal, but alive. She's alive, Theodore breathed, disbelief thick in his voice. Magda stepped forward, already untying the bundle she'd brought, bread, cheese, a skin of water. Supplies meant for their own lunch, not for a corpse. Don't! Theodore hissed, grabbing Magda's wrist before she could cross the threshold. The Baroness said no one touches her, no one interferes. She gave explicit orders. The Baroness, Magda interrupted, her voice low and dangerous, is not God, and I will not stand here and watch a child die for that woman's amusement. She wrenched her arm free and stepped into the cellar. The dog's growls intensified, a collective rumble that vibrated through the stone floor. But Magda did not flinch. She had raised 9 children, buried 4, and outlived 2 husbands. She had seen wolves in winter, soldiers in wartime, and fever in the night. 7 starving dogs did not frighten her. She knelt slowly, keeping her movements smooth and unthreatening, and placed the bundle on the ground halfway between herself and Ilona. Then she stepped back. Eat, she commanded in Romanian, switching from Hungarian to the language of the villagers, the language of Ilona's childhood. Before you forget how. Ilona stared at the bundle as if it were an apparition. Her hands would not move. Her body had forgotten the possibility of food, had resigned itself to death so completely that survival seemed like a cruel joke. But the dogs had not forgotten. The scarred male, the leader who had been the first to lie beside her, rose slowly. He approached the bundle, nose twitching, every muscle coiled with wariness. Theodore's hand moved to the knife at his belt. Magda, get back. The dog tore into the cloth with his teeth, scattering bread and cheese across the stone. He did not eat. Instead, he took a piece of bread in his jaws, gently, deliberately, and carried it back to Ilona. He dropped it in her lap, then returned for another piece, and another. The other dogs followed his lead, each one bringing food to the girl who had mourned their dead, who had sung to them in darkness, who had chosen to die with them rather than beg for mercy that would never come. Magda's eyes filled with tears. Dumnazul, she whispered. My God. Theodore stood frozen, his weathered face pale as parchment. The Baroness must never know about this. What happened next would require the kind of courage that does not announce itself with trumpets or banners. It was the quiet courage of people who had nothing but could still choose defiance. Magda and Theodore made a pact in that cellar, unspoken but absolute. They would keep Ilona alive. Not out of rebellion. Servants did not rebel, not if they wanted to keep their positions, their lives, their families safe, but out of something more fundamental, out of the belief that some cruelties were too obscene to stand witness to without action. For the next 4 days they came in secret, before dawn when the Baroness still slept off the previous night's wine. They brought water first, precious life-giving water that Ilona drank so desperately she choked on it. Then thin broth, because solid food would kill a body as starved as hers. Then bread softened in milk, then scraps of meat. They brought enough for the dogs too, though this was harder to justify, harder to hide. 7 Kangals could consume a week's worth of kitchen stores in a single day, but Magda was resourceful. She filched bones from the Baroness's table, claiming they were for soup stock. She diverted portions meant for the estate's other animals. She bartered with the village butcher, trading her own preserves for offal and gristle. Theodore smuggled in straw and old blankets, creating bedding that would keep Ilona from freezing. He brought a bucket for waste, maintaining what little dignity could exist in a tomb. He even brought a comb, and watched in silence as Ilona worked it through hair so matted it had begun to dreadlock. They told no one. Not the other servants who might gossip or panic, not the village priest who was in the Baroness's pocket, not their own families who they were protecting through ignorance. The secret became a third presence in their lives, heavy as iron, sharp as glass, and each day they descended those stairs, they knew they were gambling with their lives, because the Baroness did not forgive disobedience, and she did not forget. On the 8th day she came to the cellar herself. Erzsébet Corvinus did not walk. She swept, her silk skirts hissing against stone like a serpent's warning. She descended the cellar stairs with a candelabra in one hand and a riding crop in the other, tools of illumination and punishment carried with equal ease. Behind her trailed Ferenc, her steward, a weasel of a man with ink-stained fingers and a spine like wet rope, and David, the master of Hounds, a brute whose scarred knuckles told the story of a life spent breaking things that resisted. The Baroness had come to witness her victory. 8 days had passed since she had sealed the door, long enough surely for nature to run its course. She expected to find bones, perhaps scraps of cloth, maybe a skull picked clean, testament to her absolute dominion. What she found instead stopped her at the threshold. Ilona sat upright against the far wall, thin as a wraith, but undeniably alive. Her eyes, those eyes that had dared to meet the Baroness's gaze at dinner, stared back now with something that looked less like fear and more like recognition. The recognition of one predator acknowledging another, and the dogs. All 7 of them arranged in a semicircle before Ilona, not cowering, not cringing, but watching, waiting. The Baroness's face remained composed, but her knuckles whitened around the candelabra. "Impossible," she whispered, and the word echoed in the stone chamber like a curse. Ferenc shifted nervously. "My lady, perhaps the dogs were not as hungry as we—" Silence. Her voice could have frozen blood. She stepped into the cellar, each footfall deliberate, performative. She was accustomed to fear. She fed on it. She expected Ilona to shrink, to beg, to weep. Instead, the girl stood, slowly, painfully using the wall for support, but she stood, and when she stood, the dog stood with her. "You were supposed to die," the Baroness said, and there was genuine confusion in her voice, as if Ilona had broken some fundamental law of the universe. Ilona's voice, when she finally spoke, was hoarse but clear. So were they. The lead dog growled, low and steady, a promise. The Baroness's composure cracked. Not visibly, she was too skilled at maintaining the mask of nobility, but in the way her breathing changed, shallow and quick, in the way her free hand twitched toward her throat. She had built her entire existence on a single principle: absolute control. Control over her servants, her lands, her narrative. She had survived her husband's disgrace, his mysterious death, the whispers that followed, by becoming more terrifying than any rumor, by proving that she could not be touched, questioned, or defied. And now this peasant girl, this nothing, this debt payment, stood before her with 7 starving beasts at her side, and challenged that principle simply by breathing. "David," the Baroness commanded, her voice tight as a garrote, "take the dogs, chain them. I want them destroyed by nightfall." The master of hounds stepped forward, pulling an iron chain from his belt. He was a large man, accustomed to dominating animals through force and pain. He had trained these very dogs, had beaten obedience into them since they were puppies. But when he crossed the threshold into the cellar, when he raised the chain with its familiar rattle, the dogs did not cower. They did not recognize his authority. 8 days in darkness had rewritten the hierarchy. The pack no longer belonged to him. The scarred male lunged, not to attack, not yet, but to block, positioning himself between David and Ilona with a speed that belied his weakened state. The other 6 followed, forming a living wall, their growls harmonizing into a sound that was less animal and more elemental. David froze. For the first time in his brutal career, he felt something he had made countless creatures feel: fear. "They won't come," Ilona said quietly, and every head turned to her, human and canine alike. "They don't serve you anymore." The Baroness's face transformed, the mask shattered. What emerged beneath was something raw and ugly, rage mixed with fear, power confronted by its own impotence. She raised the riding crop. "Then you will all burn together." Ference gasped. Even he, spineless creature that he was, understood that this was madness. "My lady," Ference stammered, his voice climbing into a register reserved for panic, "the dogs are valuable, bred from Turkish stock worth more than—" "I said burn." The Baroness did not shout. She did not need to. The words fell like an executioner's blade, final and absolute. "David, fetch oil and torches. We will smoke them out if they will not come willingly. And when they run, mad with fire and fear, we will shoot them in the courtyard like the rabid things they are." David hesitated, his eyes flickering between the Baroness and the dogs, calculating. He had been in her employ for 12 years. He had seen her order a stable boy whipped until bone showed through flesh for the crime of looking at her directly. He had watched her have a maid's hand held over a candle flame for breaking a wine glass. He knew what happened to those who questioned her commands, but he also knew dogs, and he knew that what he was seeing in this cellar defied every principle of animal behavior he had learned. Dogs did not protect humans who could not feed them. Dogs did not reject their masters for strangers. Dogs did not choose loyalty over survival. Unless something had happened in this darkness that he could not understand. Unless the girl had somehow done what the Baroness, with all her cruelty and power, could never do. She had earned their trust instead of demanding their obedience. "Go," the Baroness hissed when David did not move. "Or would you prefer to burn with them?" That was the moment, the precise second when the fragile architecture of her power began to crumble. Because David, this man who had spent his life breaking wills and crushing spirits, did something unprecedented. He looked at Ilona, then at the dogs, then back at the Baroness, and he said, "No." The word hung in the air like smoke. Ference's mouth fell open. The Baroness went perfectly still, her face draining of color until she looked like a porcelain doll, beautiful and lifeless. "What did you say?" "I said, no, my lady, I will not burn these dogs, and I will not burn this girl." "Stop for a moment. Breathe. What you are hearing is not a fairy tale. It is the stubborn reality of those who refuse to vanish quietly into the cruelty of their age. Ilona's name appears in no history book. The Baroness's crimes were sealed in estate records that burned a century ago. But the story survived. It survived in whispers, in songs, in the collective memory of villages that understood what the powerful tried to erase. If you believe these voices deserve to echo louder than the silence imposed upon them, subscribe. Let this channel become a monument to the forgotten, a ledger where their defiance is recorded and honored. Comment below with one word, the quality you would need to survive what Ilona survived. Courage, fury, love? Because we are only halfway through this descent, and what comes next will test everything you think you know about justice, about vengeance, and about the cost of freedom. Now let us return to the cellar, to the moment rebellion became revolution. The Baroness moved with the speed of a viper. The riding crop slashed through the air and struck David across the face, splitting his cheek open from cheekbone to jaw. Blood sprayed across the limestone walls in an arc that caught the candlelight and gleamed like rubies. He staggered but did not fall, did not apologize, did not recant. The defiance in his eyes only hardened. "You dare!" the Baroness breathed, her voice shaking with an emotion that might have been fury or might have been something closer to terror. "You dare refuse me? I own you. I own your wife, your children, the very ground they sleep on. I could have you hanged before sunset." "Then hang me." David's voice was steady despite the blood pouring down his neck, soaking into his collar. "Hang me and explain to the magistrate why you locked a girl in a cellar with starving dogs. Explain it to the provincial governor. Explain it to the church." Ference made a strangled sound. Because David had done something brilliant and terrible, he had named the unnameable. The Baroness's power depended on silence, on the complicity of those who witnessed her cruelties and looked away. But once named, once spoken aloud, once given shape in language, the crime could not be unspoken, and there were limits, even for nobility. The empire was modernizing, however slowly. The old feudal powers were being challenged. Newspapers existed now, telegraph lines. A scandal of this magnitude, a noblewoman torturing a peasant girl for sport, would travel. It would reach Vienna. It would destroy what little remained of the Corvinus name. The Baroness understood this in the same instant Ference did. Her face cycled through expressions too quickly to catalogue: rage, calculation, fear, and finally something worse than any of them: impotence. She had overreached, had let her madness eclipse her cunning, and now she stood in a cellar with witnesses to an atrocity she could not undo, could not justify, could not contain. "Get out," she whispered. Then louder, her voice cracking, "Get out, all of you. Take the girl, take the beasts. I want them gone from my sight." It was not mercy. It was survival. Hers, not theirs. Theodore appeared at the cellar entrance as if summoned. He had been listening from the shadows, waiting, his old heart pounding against his ribs like a prisoner against bars. When the Baroness's command echoed up the stairs, he descended quickly, bringing with him a lantern and the kind of practical determination that comes from a lifetime of surviving other people's chaos. He did not speak. There was nothing to say. He simply moved to Ilona's side and offered his arm. She took it, her hand trembling, her legs uncertain after 8 days of cold stone and near death. The dogs watched this exchange with ears pricked forward, alert to any threat. But Theodore had brought no weapons, no chains, and they recognized in him the same scent that had accompanied food and water during their imprisonment, the scent of someone who had chosen mercy when cruelty was easier. The climb up the cellar stairs took an eternity. Each step was a negotiation between Ilona's depleted body and her iron will. Twice her knees buckled. Twice Theodore caught her. Behind them came the dogs, moving in formation, the scarred male at the rear, guarding their retreat like a general protecting an evacuation. David followed last, one hand pressed to his split cheek, his blood leaving a trail of dark droplets on the stone. When they emerged into the manor's lower corridor, the servants who had been hovering nearby, listening, terrified, uncertain, gasped collectively. Some crossed themselves. Others simply stared. Because what emerged from that cellar was not a broken girl and 7 broken animals. It was something else. Something that looked, in the early morning light filtering through the leaded windows, almost biblical. Ilona, pale as communion bread, skeletal and hollow-eyed, draped in rags that might as well have been robes. The dogs ranged around her like disciples or guardians, their eyes still fierce despite their hunger. And behind them, the servants who had chosen rebellion, Small, quiet, dangerous rebellion over complicity. Magda pushed through the crowd, her face wet with tears, and wrapped Ilona in a wool blanket that smelled of kitchen smoke and yeast. "Come, child," she murmured in Romanian. "Let us take you somewhere she cannot reach." They did not go to the servants' quarters, too close, too easily accessed by the Baroness's remaining loyalists. Instead, Theodore led them across the frost-brittle grounds toward the old gamekeeper's cottage at the edge of the estate, a stone structure that had stood empty since the previous keeper died 3 winters past. The procession moved in silence, broken only by the crunch of frozen grass beneath their feet and the labored breathing of the dogs. Dawn was breaking over the Carpathian foothills, painting the sky in shades of iron and blood. Villagers who rose early to tend livestock stopped their work and stared. Word would spread faster than wildfire. It always did in places where life moved slowly and gossip was the only entertainment that cost nothing. By noon, every household within 10 miles would know. The Baroness's slave girl had survived the dogs. By sunset, the story would begin its transformation into legend. The cottage was small but solid, with a fireplace that still drew properly and walls thick enough to hold warmth. Magda had thought ahead. There was firewood stacked inside, blankets, a pot of stew still warm from the manor kitchen, bread wrapped in cloth. She had been preparing this refuge even before the Baroness gave her command, understanding with the instinct of someone who had survived worse regimes that escape was inevitable. Ilona collapsed onto the straw mattress near the hearth and did not move. Her body had carried her this far on will alone. Now that safety, relative, temporary, fragile safety, had been reached, it simply surrendered. The dogs circled the small space, sniffing corners, marking territory, and then, one by one, they settled around her. The scarred male positioned himself at the door, facing outward. Sentinel, protector. Theodore knelt to build a fire, his weathered hands shaking slightly, not from cold, but from the delayed shock of what he had witnessed, what he had participated in. "She will come for the girl," Ferenc said from the doorway. He had followed them, though no one had invited him. His voice was flat, defeated. "The Baroness does not forgive. She does not forget. Let her come." David's voice cut through the cottage like an axe through kindling. He stood at the window, his ruined face half-shadowed, watching the manor in the distance. The bleeding had slowed but not stopped. Crimson still seeped through the cloth he held to his cheek. Let her come with her threats and her riding crop and her delusions of divine right. She will find something different than what she expects. Magda looked up from where she was spooning broth into Ilona's mouth. "You cannot fight her, David. None of us can. She has the law, the magistrate, the church." "She has nothing," he interrupted, and there was something in his voice that made even the dog's ears swivel toward him. "She has a name that is already whispered with disgust from here to Bucharest. She has wealth that is mortgaged to creditors in 3 countries. She has power that depends entirely on our fear, and I am done being afraid." He turned from the window, and his face, bloody, split, defiant, looked like something carved from ancient wood, like the faces of saints in rural churches who had been martyred for truths they refused to recant. The girl survived 8 days in darkness with 7 starving predators and emerged leading them like a shepherd. Do you understand what that means? Do you grasp the symbolism that every peasant and priest within 100 miles will see in this? Ferenc's eyes widened. He understood politics the way a rat understands sewers. "They will make her a saint," he whispered. "Or a witch," Theodore added quietly, feeding wood to the growing fire. "Either way, untouchable. Either way, more powerful in her suffering than the Baroness ever was in her cruelty." Ilona said nothing. She was drifting in and out of consciousness, her body finally allowing itself to rest now that immediate danger had passed. But even in her, half-sleep, she heard their words, heard herself being transformed from person to symbol, from victim to vessel. She had wanted only to survive, but survival, it seemed, had consequences. The dog shifted closer, forming a tighter circle. Outside, the sun climbed higher, indifferent and eternal. and in the manor the Baroness sat alone in her chamber, staring at her reflection in a silver mirror and seeing perhaps for the first time the face of someone who had lost. 3 weeks later, Ilona walked out of the Carpathian foothills with all 8 dogs following. Not 7, 8. Because in the cottage, sustained by broth and bread and the stubborn kindness of servants who had become revolutionaries, she had done something the Baroness could never have imagined. She had honored the dead. She had wrapped the young male's body in cloth Magda had provided and buried him behind the cottage with her own hands, digging through frozen earth until her fingers bled. She had sung the same collida over his grave that she had sung in the cellar, and in doing so she had bound the living dogs to her not through dominance or hunger, but through grief acknowledged and mourned. The Baroness never came for her. Some said she locked herself in the manor and drank herself into madness. Others claimed she fled to Vienna under cover of darkness, pursued by creditors and scandal. The estate was seized by the provincial government 6 months later for unpaid debts. The manor burned in 1871, some said lightning, others said arson, many whispered divine judgment. Ilona disappeared into the fabric of rural Romania, and the stories that followed her ranged from the plausible to the impossible. Some said she became a healer in the mountains, her dogs protecting travelers from wolves and bandits. Others claimed she joined a convent, and the dogs lived in the courtyard, never leaving her side even in prayer. A few swore they had seen her decades later, still young, still walking the old roads with an impossible pack that had somehow never aged. But this much is documented, recorded in the journal of a traveling priest who passed through Valțeia in 1869. I met a girl who had been locked in darkness to die and walked out leading her executioners. She told me she learned something in that cellar that the powerful will never understand, that love is not the opposite of violence, survival is, and survival, when shared, becomes something holy. The Baroness's name is forgotten. Ilona's is whispered still.